I know what you're thinking. This is the first Sunday, our first normal Sunday of 2018. Now, last week was a bit unique as we had what we call Celebration Sunday, which is the first Sunday of every year that we have. But today we settle back into what is typically the routine around here from Sunday to Sunday. And with that will be my very first sermon of 2018. And so I know what you're thinking. Keep it short and sweet. Now, I have heard that before, stated like that, but maybe in your mind right now, that's more of a question. Will he keep it short and sweet? Will it be short and sweet? Well, of those two things, I can really only control one. I can control how short this is going to be. But I really can't control how sweet it will be. That will depend from week to week on the topic of what text we're looking at and where you're at personally in your life. We want short and sweet. We might not get both. Now, as much as you might be asking that of me this morning, I wonder if you've ever asked that of yourself. I wonder if you've ever asked that about your life. Will my life be short and sweet? Now, it's funny how all of a sudden short doesn't sound that good, does it? But of those two things, you can really only control one. You can't control how short your life is going to be. But you do have some control over how sweet it is. Whether life will be kind to you, whether there will be favor. We want sweet, don't we? From the words of that great philosopher, Forrest Gump, life is like a box of chocolates. Wouldn't it be awesome if every day actually was that sweet? I mean, we would like that. We want that. We will get short. We might not get sweet. We might not get both. So I know what you're thinking. Although right now it might be more of a question. How? How is life going to be sweet? Is that what you're tasting? Really? Is that what you could say is on your lips today? Just that life is sweet? It will be short. Will it be sweet? Well, just a few moments ago when our service began, Lauren read to us Psalm chapter 90. So let's turn to that text, Psalm chapter 90. I'm not going to read it again because Lauren did a great job reading that for us this morning to call us to worship. But turn there with me to Psalm chapter 90. We learn a few things in Psalm chapter 90 that are going to kickstart this series we're now in called Sacred Things. Sacred Things. The first thing we learn from Psalm 90 is this: life is short. Life is short. Okay, that's the reality. Life is short. Now, you might not be believing me on that one right now, but the first 6 verses makes that very, very clear. It really just depends on who you compare your life to. Well, if you compared your life to God, what would your conclusion be? Look at verse 2. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. God is not bound to time like us. With God, there is no beginning and there is no end. He makes that very clear in Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, when he says, hey, I am the beginning and I am the end. Many verses just conclude that truth that God is everlasting. In Job chapter 36, verse 26, He says, the number of his years is past our finding out. Or Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28, when the question is asked, don't you know? Have you not heard? The Lord is everlasting to everlasting. Okay? God is not bound to time. But we are clearly within time's grasp. Look at verse 3 to 6. Look what it says here. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. A watch was about 4 hours long. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it's dry and withered. How many people feel like that after a long day? Life that we get to live in these bodies for a little while is temporal. It's temporal. It's temporary. And in verse 3 to 6, we hear some truth about that. We hear that life is fragile. Life is fragile. And we're constantly reminded of that. We're constantly reminded of this, even though we are surprised when we are. I remember when Danielle and I were first married, in the matter of 1 year, in the course of about 1 year, I heard of 4 of my friends from high school who I either played basketball with or did something with, who suddenly just died. They were in their mid-20s. 4 of my friends. One of them on a motorcycle. One of them in a car. 2 of them on a bed as cancer took them within days of their diagnosis. Life is fragile. And we're constantly reminded of that. And life is fleeting. Here one day, gone the next. No, we don't know when our time is going to come, but we do know time is going to get us. Our time will come. James 4:14 says it like this: your life is just a vapor. Here one day, boom, gone the next. Life is short. So many inspirational sayings start with that. They try to inspire us, and they start with these first 3 words: life is short. Probably the most simple, inspirational saying that started with that was said by Lady Mary Montagu, who simply said this: life is far too short for a long story. Which is why she wrote mostly poems and wrote letters. Because life is short. Life is short, and what guarantees that is sin. Sin guarantees that. I mean, Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is life. No, the wages of sin is what? It's death. No one's going to escape that. Okay? No one's going to escape that spiritual disease that's coursing through our veins that God absolutely hates. God hates that. God hates sin. We see that in verse 7 when the psalmist says, we are consumed by your anger. And that's where the anger is directed towards. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. God hates sin. Sin that will not escape God's knowledge. Verse 8, you have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Sin that assures difficulties in life. Verse 9 to 10, all your days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. Sin guarantees us that life is short. For they quickly pass, and we fly away. Life is short. You know, you compare your life and your years that you're going to get to an everlasting God who has no beginning and no end. This is what your life amounts to. Now, that does not mean that it doesn't mean anything. It means you have a very short window, a very small window to get it sweet, to find sweet. See, life will be short, but will it be sweet? How do you find that? How do you find that? We dip our fingers in a lot of things looking for sweet, don't we? We dip our fingers in a lot of things looking for sweet. Most of it doesn't last, which is why we got to keep dipping. It leaves us empty. It makes us look for the next thing. And yet those next things, most of them leave a bad aftertaste. A little bit like eating shrimp, sour cream onion chips, and olives. Man, sorry about that. That's the bad aftertaste. As a culture, we put our greasy paws over a lot of things looking for sweet. We've got our greasy paws on a lot of things just trying to find what sweet's going to be. And now that's dripping down our forearms. And the impact of those things will be seen for what they are. And to me, most of those things amount to kind of like that drip tray in the bottom of your barbecue. They all get dripped into there, and you really don't know what to do with this now. You don't want it, and it's tucked away so no one will see it, you hope. But now what do you do with this thing? I ask that question every summer. What am I supposed to do with this stuff? I don't want it. It's gross. See, what our culture has lost, that is absolutely essential for a life well lived, is a taste for what is sacred. It's a taste for sacred things. Those things that God tells us are important to Him and that are precious in His eyes, not anybody else's. It's a renewed understanding of these sacred things that God holds as important that will ultimately see life flourish. And the psalmist takes us there. See, in verse 12, key verse for us, verse 12 is this statement that the psalmist makes. It's in a sense a sort of plea. It's a personal call to action because the alternative is not good. Verse 12 says this: teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Oh God, give us wisdom. Give us wisdom. And wisdom is not how we are to see the world in the lens of its latest ideology. That is not what the Bible says is wisdom. Wisdom comes from God, who designed life to function in a certain way in order to thrive. And so we will only gain wisdom when we see God for all that God is, which is the sense we get from verse 11. Look at verse 11, at least to verse 12. If only we knew the power of your anger, if only we could see you for all that you are and see things in light of how you see things. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. See God for all that he is. That is how we gain wisdom. The book of Proverbs is probably the most famous book that we quote when we talk about wisdom. And in Proverbs 2, chapter 2, we read this. It says, "Turn your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless, for he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. Then you will understand what is right and just and fair, every good path, for wisdom will enter your heart." God, give us wisdom. Give us wisdom. Help us to see you for all that you are, so that we can see life and see things the way that you see them. Teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of understanding. Help us to know that we only got a very short window to get this right. We have a very small window to understand sacred things and to understand this: life is sacred. Life is sacred. It matters. It's important. Every day counts. Teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Do you know life is sacred? Do you truly understand life is sacred? Every day you get is a gift from God, who created you in his very image. Life is sacred to him. In Genesis 1:27, he very clearly tells us that. For God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male, female, he created them. You were created in the very image of God. Not in the image of a bug, not in the image of a snake, not in the image of a cow or a donkey or whatever other names people call you. You were created in the very image of a loving, personal, gracious, merciful, compassionate, everlasting God. And that makes life sacred. Your life will be short, but will it be sweet? Life will be sweet when we live knowing that. Life will be sweet when we live knowing it's sacred. See, knowing that you're created in the image of God gets us started, but it's not enough. It's not enough. That word sacred can mean holy. Holy. Holy means that you are set apart. That's kind of the classic definition. Holy means that we are set apart, which means that we do things differently, that we do things the way that God tells us to do things, that we're going to live life that way. And that means that we must understand what God says is sacred. We must understand that. And the psalmist in verse 7 to 12 makes it very, very clear to us that it's sinful things that get in the way of sacred things. Sinful things get in the way of sacred things. And that's a problem. And so you have to deal with those sinful things. Teach us, God, to number our days that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Help us understand we have a very small window to get this one right and to deal with those sinful things that keep us from the sacred things. Let me ask you this. If you know today was your last day and that you weren't going to wake up tomorrow, how would it be different? Think about that. If you knew you weren't waking up tomorrow, that this day was your last, how would today be different? What would you all of a sudden not care about? Some of your plans just might have been eliminated. Some of these things that you don't care, that you care about may not become important. But you will learn very, very quickly what is important to you. What is extremely important to you. If that were the case, and we knew this was our last day, do you think life would become any less important? Just because it's ticking down in the hours? No way. All of a sudden, life becomes incredibly important to you. Life becomes incredibly important to you. You will spend your energy and your time on those things that are important, with those people that are important. And I can guarantee you that if you knew this day was your last, relationships would all of a sudden go to the top of the pile. That you would want to do life and you'd want to spend your last hours in relationship with those people that matter to you. And I can guarantee you that if there is issues between you and those people that matter to you, and you only had a small window to get those things right, you would do it. You can't wait anymore. And so you would have that conversation. You would make that phone call. You would say those things that need to be said. You only have hours left. That would matter to you all of a sudden. That would become the most important thing. If that were the case, that's how you would spend your last moments. Well, what the psalmist is telling us is that is the case. That is the case. Here one day, gone the next. So he's telling us very clearly, you got to get your relationships right. You have to get that most important relationship in your life right. And the most important relationship in your life is the one that you need to have or have with God, but that sinful things prevent. Teach us to number our days so that we would gain a heart of wisdom. God, help us to understand. We only have a small window of time to get this one right. We only have a small window of time to understand what God says is sacred, to understand His sacred things. And so we need to understand this one. That it's only God who can take a sinful thing, like me, like you, and make it a sacred thing. Only God can take a sinful thing and make it a sacred thing. Only God can make us holy. In our relationship with Him, that is what matters most of all. When we receive Christ by faith, believing in all of our heart that it's only God who can actually forgive, it's only God who can take away our sins. When we go to Him by faith, and the promise of the Scriptures is this: He makes you holy in His sight. Only God can take a sinful thing and make it a sacred thing. Colossians 1:21 to 22 and to 23 says this. See, once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Verse 22, but now, you have been reconciled by Christ's physical body through death, so that he can present you holy in his sight, without blemish, and free from accusation. Life becomes sweet when we live knowing it's sacred. And that starts with understanding our image, that we're image bearers. But that's not enough. We need to know that only God can truly make our life sacred. So verse 23 in Colossians 1 says this, if you keep the faith. There's a way that God requires us to live now. God requires us to live in holy ways, with a holy understanding of truly knowing what it means to be sacred in his sight. That's how life is sweet. That's how we get it. Life is sweet by living knowing it's sacred. And God will guarantee that one. God will guarantee that. Psalm 90 is full of promises, full of hope that we receive from understanding that and having that relationship with God. In verse 1, it says, Lord, you've been our dwelling place throughout all generations. God makes us secure. He protects us. We have security in that. Verse 13 through the end is where we really get and hear some of these benefits. In verse 14, it says, we will be satisfied by God's unfailing love. How much God loves us satisfies us. Every day we know that. It goes on to say that we'll be able to sing for joy and be glad all of our days. Why is that? Because we have been made sacred, holy in God's sight. The relationship that matters the most is in place. We can sing for that, joyful in our hearts. Verse 16 says we can have the self-confidence knowing that God is on our side. Look at what it says. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. God, keep showing us this. Keep showing us your work in our life. We have self-confidence knowing that God is on our side. And in verse 17 at the end, it says that we will have success in all the things that God will establish for us as we live our life in these holy ways. And our understanding of sacred things. To me, the cherry on top of this whole chapter is the very first part of verse 17 when it says this. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. That word favor means may the beauty of God rest on us. May the kindness of all that God is rest on us. And the word can be translated like this. May the sweetness of all who God is rest on us. God guarantees life is going to be sweet when we live knowing it's sacred. Not just that we're image bearers, but that we become holy, sacred in his sight, and then live the way God requires us to live. God guarantees it. Life is sweet when we live knowing it's sacred. Do you understand sacred things? You really understand that your life is sacred. That God has called you to have a relationship with him, to be holy, to be made holy, and to walk in those holy things. few years ago, there was a movie made. And by the way, this is not a movie recommendation. It was called The Hateful Eight. The Hateful Eight. It was made in 2015. And the star of the movie was Kurt Russell. And one of those scenes of that movie, he was to take a guitar and smash it to smithereens. And the guitar that he was meant to smash was a Martin guitar. Those of you who are guitar enthusiasts might know that name. Just a nice, gorgeous, beautiful guitar. The guitar was loaned to them by a museum, a Martin museum. So obviously, before that guitar was smashed, it was meant to be switched out with one that was cheaper, with one that wasn't quite as valuable. The problem was no one told Kurt Russell that. And so to the shock of everybody on set, when they were supposed to cut and switch the guitars that no one told Kurt Russell about, instead of smashing this guitar, this old, cheap guitar, Kurt Russell took this Martin guitar, built in 1870, worth north of $40,000, and smashed it to smithereens on set. Apparently they kept the cut because no one had to act. They were just all in shock. What are you doing? All that happened because someone just didn't tell Kurt how valuable it was. There's many of us today in our world that are doing the exact same thing with their life. No one's told them how valuable it is. So I know what you're thinking. Keep it short and sweet. Well, when it comes to your life, you only have control over the one. And our prayer, my prayer for you, is that that's exactly what it would be. But it only will be if you understand just how sacred life is. God, today, we thank you for Psalm chapter 90 and what we could learn and reflect on in that. God, give us a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days that we could gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to understand, God, more than anything today. We just have a very small window to get this right. Just a small window to get this right. So perhaps today it's been a refresher. For others, it's been just monumental to hear their life is made in your image. That life is made in your image, that we bear your image. We are not a waste. We are not nothing to you. You created us special. But God, more than that, again, help us to remember and be reminded of sacred things, that life is sacred, but it's meant to be lived that way. It's meant to be lived that way. We're living in a time and in an age where we are told that how to live life and how to do life is just so different and contradictory to the things that you tell us to do, to the ways that you tell us to walk. And it can all feel like a fog sometimes. It's just so confusing. And we look around at what's happening and we really wonder sometimes what in the world is going on. Well, what in the world is going on is that the world has stopped looking at life as sacred, truly understanding what you call it to be, what you desire it to be, the ways that you want it to go. Challenge us with that today, God. Do we really understand life is meant to be holy, that only you can do that? And being made in your sight and holy in your sight means to be walking holy in your sight, that we live life differently now, set apart from all these ways that end up being a drip can of grease and oil that we want to get rid of, but we would really see the sweetness that only you can offer by doing things the way you tell us to do them. And whatever we're facing today, and wherever we're going to go, wherever that is, whether it's to work tomorrow, whether it's in your car, whether it's just hanging out at home with your family, whatever it is, God, help us, please, to number our days. We may gain a heart of wisdom, to truly, truly understand. We just have a small window to get this right. Just a small window to understand your sacred things and how life is meant to be lived likewise. May it be short and sweet. In your name we pray.